Hello everyone, this is Mr. Jackson, and we're going to be getting into part 2 of our Module 3 lecture over the circulatory system, namely the heart. Okay, so we're still in the physiological part of this discussion with the heart, and I have on the screen right now a very good summary of how we are going to conclude this Module 3 lecture. And so you can see here that this is going to be a discussion of the cardiac cycle. We'll also discuss how that translates to the sounds that we typically associate with the heart and its function. And we can break down the sequence of events in this cardiac cycle, which is again a fancy word for a single heartbeat. We can break these down into steps. And as we go through each of these phases, it's important to identify a couple of really good aspects of this. First one, obviously, understanding the name of the phase, what's happening. Okay, so what are the major events that are happening during this phase? What is happening with our valves, both the AV, so those atrioventricular, the bicuspid, tricuspids, and our semilunar valves? What are they in the act of doing? And that can kind of help us understand how we're keeping blood flowing at the time in a single direction and where it's at. And then also useful visuals, right? So showing these, useful arrows. To what extent are these chambers filled or emptied of blood? And in what direction is that blood being moved? Contractions, all of these things are really good visually represented. So we're going to get right into this, and this will be the extent of part 2. Okay, so whenever we're referring to the cardiac cycle, this is one complete heartbeat, okay, in which both the atria and the ventricles have time to contract and then relax, okay? So this one full cycle, which is a heartbeat. Now, we have two vocabulary words that we use to refer to contraction and relaxation. Systole is referring to contraction, or, that active component of either atria or ventricular action. And then diastole, which is relaxation. Okay, so if we are at work, this is systole. If we are at rest, that is diastole. And our average heart rate, as we addressed in part 1, you can think of it being around 75 beats per minute. That would be a normal resting rate. And our cardiac cycle, given that rate, would therefore take about 0.8 seconds. Okay, so about every 0.8 to 1 second, you've got a full cardiac cycle, which is what we're about to discuss. So this is happening very quickly. We're just going to slow it down so we understand the steps involved. All right, so step 1, atrial diastole and ventricular filling. So this is saying that the atria are relaxed and the ventricles are filling with blood. Okay, so heart's relaxed in general. Okay, so no pumping, no contraction anywhere in the heart muscle. Okay, so the pressure in the heart overall is low. Those atrioventricular valves at this point are just hanging loosely. They're open, and blood is flowing passively into the atria and into the ventricles. Okay, so on the right side, we've got that deoxygenated blood flowing passively just into the atria and into the ventricles. Oxygenated blood coming from the lungs is doing the same. Okay, and at this point, so that we don't have an ongoing, I would say an ongoing transmission of that blood supply up through the either pulmonary arteries or aorta, we have our semilunar valves closed. Okay, so it's passively entering the ventricles and staying there because of this. Okay, so that is atrial diastole. That's step 1. Step 2. So now those atria are going to contract. They're going to become active. They are going to go into what we call systole. Okay, so at this point, the ventricles are still resting. Okay, they're still filling with blood. Okay, but the atria are going to contract, therefore forcing additional blood into the ventricles to complete this filling process. So atrial systole is more now an active ventricular filling process rather than just an ongoing passive one. Okay, and you can see in the image here, at this point, those atria are contracting. You see here, little contraction there. Okay, not going to be as powerful as the ventricles. There's less cardiac muscle to do it, right? So we're going to have a contraction of the atria, and you can kind of see here that what was completely filled before in those chambers, we've now had a decrease in that overall blood volume, and so the pressure is decreasing in the atria compared to the ventricles. Okay, step 3. We call it isovolumetric contraction. Okay, so let's break down what's happening here. At this point, the atrial contraction, the systole, has ended. Okay, so we don't have any more contraction of the atria. And ventricular systole, so that active contraction of the ventricles, those pumping or discharging chambers, at this point, that is going to begin. Okay, so atrial systole has completed, ventricular systole has started. Okay, and so what this means is the intra or inner ventricular pressure has now risen to a great deal. Think back to part 1. This means that we're going to close those AV valves because that pressure is going to push against those valves and close them so that there's no backflow back into the atria, only going to go forward in a single direction. And for a moment, what this also means is that those ventricles are completely closed. Right? Contraction has only just started, and so we haven't quite opened our semilunar valves to allow all that blood to be pushed anywhere. Okay? So this is really just sort of like that intermediary, that isovolumetric contraction, where the atria are done, the ventricles start, and so it actually creates a closed off seal where all the valves are currently closed for a moment, and that pressure is building up really, really quickly. And then, naturally, our AV valves are closed, there's no backflow into the atria, and at this point we reach ventricular systole, and this is our ejection phase or our discharge phase. This is where blood is going to be pumped to wherever it's going, whether that's to the lungs via the pulmonary arteries to reoxygenate that blood supply, or to the body tissues to deliver that oxygenated blood supply. The ventricles are continuing to contract. That pressure is now so high that it surpasses any pressure in the major arteries of the heart that would ultimately resist or push backward against the pressure in the ventricles. And so that pressure is so great that now blood is able to move forward into that area of lower pressure, those arteries, and now blood's going to start moving. Those semilunar valves are now open, right? So that pressure's built up and it pushes those semilunar valves open. Blood is ejected from those ventricles, and the atria are now relaxed, and they begin the next part of the cycle, which is to begin passively again filling with blood. And then we have our isovolumetric relaxation. Okay, so at this point, we've had that full ejection phase, that full contraction, that pump of the heart, and now at this point, we're going to go into ventricular relaxation or diastole. That's going to begin. The pressure in the ventricles falls below that of the major arteries, meaning that the blood or the pressure in those arteries is going to push backward and close the semilunar valves. Okay, so again, preventing any sort of backflow from re-entering the heart once it's supposed to be going forward. So that's preventing backflow to the ventricles. And then for another moment, the ventricles are going to, again, be completely closed off chambers. AV valves are not yet open. We don't have enough blood in the atria yet to create that pressure to open them. And there is also not enough pressure in the ventricles to have the semilunar valves open. And so when the atrial pressure increases above that intraventricular pressure, the AV valves will open again, and then we'll repeat the process that we started with. And so now we want to associate that, so everything that we've discussed in terms of like the cardiac cycle and the conduction system and just the process involved with the valves opening and closing, we want to associate that with the sounds that we would typically associate with a heartbeat, right? And it's pretty commonly known that we associate that with what's called a lub-dup heart sound. And so whenever we are talking about the lub, right, this is a longer, louder heart sound that's ultimately caused whenever the atrioventricular valves, those bi- and tricuspid valves, close. Okay, so this at the end of atrial systole, where that pressure is higher in the ventricles compared to the atria, and those AV valves slam shut to prevent backflow into the atria, that is what causes that initial lub sound. The dup, which is a very short, sharp sound, if we were to be listening to that short, sharp sound is actually caused by the closing of the semilunar valves immediately after the ejection phase. Right, so at the end of ventricular systole, that active component, those semilunar valves are going to slam shut again. And that happens very, very quickly as well. Okay, so the lub, longer, louder, that is the AV valves closing. And then the dup, which is a short, sharp sound, is going to be at the end of ventricular systole, which is when the semilunar valves close. And then we're going to finish today with a couple more key terms of the actual physiology, a way that we can measure the physiology and the activity of the heart. And ultimately, that is going to be called our cardiac output. So what is our heart actually producing? Okay, so this is referring to the amount of blood that we are actually pumping out of each side or the ventricles in 1 minute of time. Okay, so this is ultimately going to be a product of the stroke volume and heart rate. Okay, so let's break those down. When I refer to stroke volume, this is going to be the volume of blood pumped by each ventricle in a single contraction. Okay, so every heartbeat, how much blood in milliliters am I actually pumping out of, in this case, let's just say the left ventricle to all of the body's tissues? How much blood is actually being pumped with each heartbeat? That is our stroke volume. So a single stroke, single contraction, how much volume do we supply? And then also, remember, cardiac output is over the course of a minute. And so in order to know how much we're producing in a minute, we have to know how many times our heart actually strokes or beats. And so we also have to factor in our heart rate. Okay, so heart rate, again, typically 75 beats per minute, but our cardiac output is constantly going to be fluctuating unless we're in a stable state of rest or a steady state in physical activity. It's constantly going up and down a little bit. And so the cardiac output we can expect to be, if we multiply the number of times our heart beats by how much blood our heart is pumping with each beat. Okay, so that's going to be our overall, so it's going to be how many milliliters, or by the time it's all said and done, how many liters of blood do we pump throughout our body every minute based on how many times the heart beats. And so there's a couple of different ways that each component, stroke volume and heart rate, can be regulated. And so regulation of stroke volume is basically going to be based on the following. 60% of the blood in the ventricles, so only 60%, is pumped with each heartbeat. Okay, so we always have like a dormant reserve of blood that doesn't fully get pumped. And that makes sense, right? Because the pressure in the arteries is constantly there, right? So those arteries are never empty. And so it takes less pressure to be removed from the ventricles before that pressure in the arteries is higher, and therefore pushes back against the semilunar valves and therefore stops that ventricular projection or ejection. And so only about 60% is actually pumped. We have this law called Starling's law of the heart, which basically says that the critical determinator of stroke volume is how much cardiac muscle is stretched before it's contracted. We kind of call this preload. And so this is to say that the more that cardiac muscle is initially stretched, the stronger that the contraction is going to be whenever that muscle is then contracted, right? So it's kind of like if you think about it as like a slingshot. The further back I pull that slingshot, the further or the more force that's going to generate whenever I actually snap it loose, okay? So it's very, very much the same thing with our heart contractions. So venous return, so how much blood is actually brought back to the heart, is a very important part of how much stretch is placed onto the heart muscle as well. Two factors specifically influencing the preload, right? So that initial stretching of the heart, right? amount of the venous return, like we just said, volume of blood returning to the heart, but also the length of time that the ventricles remain relaxed and are able to fill with blood. This is going to be determined by heart rate. If we have less beats per minute, then there's more time for those ventricles to fill with blood, and so therefore we can basically expect a higher stroke volume because we had more blood to eject with each stroke. We also have a couple key terms here. We have contractility. This is the ability of cardiac muscle to generate tension. So how capable is it of tensing up or contracting? And then afterload, which is basically, it's kind of like the opposite to preload, right? So afterload is the amount of pressure that the ventricles have to overcome to actually get that blood ejected. Okay? So afterload is like, what do we have to get to in order for blood to eject? Contractility is our overall ability to create tension, so how strong that tissue is. And then finally, we've got those factors that can modify our heart rate, right? So we talked about stroke volume. The other measurable factor for cardiac output is heart rate. How many times per minute are our hearts beating? We do have our neural controls, so that autonomic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system is that division that basically speeds up our heart rate, right? It's that fight or flight mechanism, right? So any sort of increased alertness or activity or requirements in your body, it's going to increase your heart rate. Parasympathetic, I mean, it's coming primarily via vagus nerve fibers. This is going to be that rest and digest, right? If we're at a position of rest and we can relax a little bit, we will slow our heart rate externally. We also have hormones and ions in our bodies that can affect heart rate. Epinephrine and thyroxine, a couple of those hormones that we discussed in Module 1, those are going to work to speed up our heart rate. We also have excess or lack of certain ions like calcium, sodium, potassium. This can modify our heart rate. And then finally, physical factors, so like age, your gender, how much exercise you get and how fit you are, body temperature. All of these things can have additional inputs on how quick your heart beats. And finally, we've got a really cool visual that just kind of focuses in on a few different factors that can modify your overall cardiac output, whether those are affecting your heart rate to either increase in blue or decrease in red, whether those are working on heart rate to do so, or stroke volume, or both. This shows all of the different ways in which we can modify how much your heart is actually producing based on whether or not it increases, decreases your stroke volume or heart rate. And feel free to hit pause on this if you'd like to review this in a little more detail. But that is going to be the end of our Module 3 lecture, Part 1 and Part 2. And I hope that you found this helpful, and we'll see you in the next module.